We're going to get started. This mini series is on educational theory, and the second session is on cognitive load theory. So the first session we covered schema theory and what a schema is, and how schema and schemata work. Patricia, have you got a hand, or are you saying you can hear me okay? Oh, not sure, but you're muted, so I can't hear you if you're trying to tell me something. So cognitive load theory is the second in this series. Now, the first one covered schema theory, which really explains how we store information in our brain, or at least the best model that we currently have for how we store information in our brains. Cognitive load theory is very much about how we get information into our brains, into a schema. So does anyone know what a schema is? Because ideally you'll say yes. Does anyone not know what a schema is? Please don't be shy, because I'm going to ask someone in a minute so we can hopefully get a definition. Okay. Will Ashton, are you there? Do you know what a schema is, Will? Can you help us out?
Yeah, so it's essentially like a database of information that you sort of store information in, and you kind of make connections between different things within the database. And then you kind of
a network.
Schemas. A network.
Network is the best way to describe it, because we store information in our brains, not like a database in a computer, which is sort of like in discrete sort of like files with codes, but we store information in our brain as a network. So a network of related information. So you know what a house is because you know things it relates to. You know it's got 4 walls, you live there, and all these other things, all these other facts that relate to related information to a house helps you understand what the concept of house even means. Unlike computers, we actually understand the connections between different pieces of information we store, and connecting it to different things completely changes the semantic meaning. So that was all what we talked about with schema theory last time. And I'm not going to go into that in tons of detail now, but thanks very much, Will, for donating us a very, very good definition that we could work with. So schema theory is really about storing rich, dense networks of information, okay? And that is how the information is stored in our brain once we've got it. But what we're talking about today is how it gets there. And cognitive load theory is again the best current idea for how we understand that information gets into our brain, into our schemata, which is the plural of schema, how it gets into our schemata and how we actually learn it in the first place, and as well as how we learn it, what the limitations are. Because as you might have guessed, cognitive load implies that there's some sort of effort or there's some challenge to overcome to learn it, because learning anything new is a challenge. So the first thing we're going to start with today is working memory. Working memory is limited. Now, working memory, does anyone know what working memory is? Feel free to give it a shot if you know. Put your hand up and we can get you to have a stab at it. Anyone got any idea what working memory is? Go on, Marianne.
So it's a very short-term period of time that your brain can take in a few things from the environment. So it could be something you see, something you hear, and so on. But it's very, very limited, and it's to help you focus and filter out all the extraneous input around. So it's a very short-term focus.
Lots of really interesting stuff there. No, fantastic. So definitely, it's very, very limited, and it's basically the things you're currently processing right now. It's kind of the closest thing we have in our brain to what in computers we call RAM, right? RAM basically controls how much stuff a computer can try and do at the same time. Random access memory is basically what the computer's doing right now. And working memory for us is effectively the same thing. It's what we're doing right now, what we're paying attention to right now, and what we're thinking about right now, because you can be lost in a daydream, not paying any notice to what's going on in the world around you. You're still using your working memory. It's just the things that it's processing are not sensory inputs from the outside world. They're things from your own memory. And someone might come up to you and be like waving in your face, like, hello, are you awake? And you're sort of oblivious to it until you sort of come around and realize there's someone waving in front of you. So brilliant. Marianne's got a really, really important point there, which is it's very, very limited, both in terms of its temporal capacity. It's not lasting any amount of time. If you stop thinking about it, very rapidly, your memory of what you were just thinking about starts to fade. And it is distinct from short-term memory, which we mean something a little bit different by short-term memory. I don't want you to think they're exactly the same. But working memory is what we're processing right now, okay? And it is very limited, both in the time span, but also in its capacity. If I get you to try and memorize completely random strings of numbers, okay, it's very difficult to do it unless you do something called chunking, which is basically grouping the numbers into little groups. So you can imagine a good way to illustrate this is your phone number. Now, if you were to tell me your phone number, now think about this in your head, you don't need to say it out loud, but if you were to say your phone number, naturally you're going to group it into 3 or 4 groups of numbers. Now do it for yourself. Imagine saying your phone number, your mobile phone number out loud. Imagine it. Do you say it as one long continuous string, or do you remember it as like 3 or 4 groups of digits? What's the answer? Who's remembering it as one continuous string of digits?
Groups of digits, right? Like four numbers, 3 numbers, 3 numbers.
Yeah. Now I'm going to be brave and say my phone number, right? Don't all run and write it down. I'm not sure we will. I'm not that interesting to talk to anyway. But my phone number is 0759 5929 193. But obviously, we even go and type it. We even put spaces between the groups of numbers. You see this when people write their phone number, they put a space in between the first group and the second group. They're so ingrained in their mind that that's how they remember it. No one remembers the entire sequence of digits as a one single block. Okay. Now, generally speaking, you'll notice that those 3 or 4 groups of digits, they all have to be less than around 5 digits long. If it's more than 5 digits, it becomes very hard to remember, right? And so this is an important thing for us to bear in mind. Normally, there's 3 or 4 digits, and there's 3 groups or 4 groups of 3 or 4 digits. So the largest kind of phone number that's easy for someone to remember and memorize is about 16 digits, 4 groups of 4. If I try and get you to memorize a number that's longer than 16 digits, it's noticeably much harder. Now, you don't need me to take my word for it. You can literally go and try this for yourself. Okay, give yourself random sequences of digits. Okay, up to around 10 or 9 or 10, which is a phone number. It's relatively easy to remember. You just chunk it. If you try and give yourself 20-digit numbers to remember, it gets considerably harder. You can still do it, but when you start making it 30, 40 digits, it's very, very hard. Okay, so chunking is a strategy that helps us to illustrate that actually our processing power, our working memory is limited, and it's limited to around 3 or 4 chunks at the same time, right? So when we want to remember more than 3 or 4 things at the same time, they need to be in chunks that we can manipulate together. And this is why it sounds odd if someone says your phone number back to you, but with the wrong chunks. You're going to have to stop for a second and go, hang on a minute. Does that match up with the way I've got it out of sequence, right? They're saying, oh, 075 959. And you're like, hang on a minute. Don't remember it like that. I remember it in a different sequence. And you'll notice that maybe has anyone had this experience where someone says your phone number back to you, but they say it in the sort of the wrong chunks, and you have to kind of think about it? Nod or shake? Nodding. Anyone shaking? No, everyone's experienced that. So working memory, as Marianne has just pointed out for us, limited in capacity, very much limited by time. When you stop thinking about something, the memory of it fades, not immediately, but very soon. Yeah, after a couple of minutes, it's gone, all gone, right? Unless it's been stored in long-term memory. Very limited in terms of capacity over time, and very limited in terms of actual capacity. And the only way we get around that is by chunking. Because immediately, if I say it's limited in capacity, you can only remember 3 or 4 things at the same time. People go, oh, my phone number is way more than 4. Well, okay, but it's only less than 3 or 4 chunks. And that's what's important. So working memory is limited. How is this relevant to cognitive load? Well, cognitive load theory, which was come up with mostly proposed by a guy called Sweller, John Sweller, back in the late 90s. But cognitive load theory is about how we get around the fact that our working memory is so limited, and how we then navigate, how we make best use of that fact to optimize storage into long-term memory by remembering things, learning things new. And there are 3 forms of cognitive load, right? And we're going to go through what these 3 forms of cognitive load are. And I'm going to give you a brief explanation for each one and an example. And then we're going to tie together how they interact together, because you can only remember, you can only process 3 or 4 chunks of information at the same time. Okay. So what are the 3 forms of cognitive load? I'm not going to ask you necessarily to come up with it unless someone wants to desperately volunteer themselves. The first one is intrinsic cognitive load. And this very much relates to how complicated the subject matter is that you're trying to process. How many different parts does it have? How many interconnected parts or interdependent parts does it have that you need to try and manipulate at the same time? So a simple shape like a square, that's very straightforward. You recognize it as a single contiguous object. It's very simple. It's very low intrinsic load. It's very easy to understand that this is a specific object. Whereas a very complex visual scene with different features, like I don't know, a picture of a forest with some animals running around in it, is a much more complex thing to try and remember. So if I said, "Oh, reproduce this image," and I've given you a square, everyone's going to be able to say, "Oh, it's fine. It was just a square." If I say, "All right, here's a photo of like a forest, or like a diagram or a drawing of a forest with all the trees and different animals. I'm going to take it away. Now draw it again." Well, there were so many different components. You're like, "Well, hang on a minute." And there was too much to try and take in all at once. Okay. So the first aspect of cognitive load that's really important is intrinsic cognitive load. How much stuff is there that is physically interdependent to make up the complete piece of information that we're trying to restore? If there's too much information, the intrinsic load is just too high. Yeah. So if there's an image which is very complicated and lots of parts, the intrinsic load is going to be very high. If it's a mathematical concept, like an equation that's got 7 variables, well, it's going to have a high intrinsic load because it's very difficult to try and remember all the different variables and how they relate to each other compared to a simple equation, right? X equals 7, very straightforward. X minus 5 equals 2. Okay, again, pretty straightforward. You can easily process that. It's got 1 variable, it's got a few symbols that you're familiar with. When we start giving you very complicated equations, like when you give GCSE students the quadratic equation for the first time, it's almost infamous for being too complicated for them to understand all at once. Does anyone here teach maths? Some nodding. Okay, a similar example for English. If you give someone a long monologue from a Shakespearean character, okay, that monologue and all of the depth of meaning is way too much for a student to understand the first time they read it. They're not going to be able to repeat it back to you the first time they've read it, right? But a very short phrase like "to be or not to be," that is the question. Is that the right one? Is there any English teachers here to come and correct me for my poor Shakespearean knowledge? But if you've got a short, sort of well-known phrase, Helen, are you an English teacher? You're going to come and correct me? No, okay. So if you've got a short phrase like that, then that's something which is relatively easy for a student to sort of pick up. Okay. So what the key things to take away about intrinsic load? Intrinsic load is about how complicated it is, how complicated the information we're trying to store is. If we're trying to store something which is very complex, very abstract, or has lots of interdependent parts, then we've got a very difficult challenge. Yeah. Potentially it's too complicated. It's going to take up too many of those chunks. And if it's more than 4, we haven't got a chance really. Okay. So first part of cognitive load is intrinsic cognitive load. This is tied to what we're trying to learn. The only way to reduce intrinsic cognitive load is to split up what we're trying to learn and learn little bits of it at a time, right? Otherwise, it's too much. So, second aspect of cognitive load, second of 3. There's 3 in total. The second type of cognitive load is called extraneous cognitive load. Now, Marianne earlier mentioned this word extraneous. And in cognitive load theory, this is what it means. It means the information, or it's the processing load required to manipulate how the information is presented to you. Okay, it's the processing load that's there because of how the information is presented to you. Has anyone ever heard the phrase, a picture paints 1,000 words? Everyone's nodding, right? If you speak English for more than a couple of years, you've heard that. It's a great example. A picture paints 1,000 words is a shorthand way of saying that describing a picture is really, really hard and takes a lot of words to try and do it even moderately well. Okay, trying to describe a visual scene is an extremely difficult thing to do, especially to do it well. Okay, think about how much just the visual scene you might be looking at now, and especially what's behind your computer, how much there is to potentially describe. Yeah, every single crack and crevice on the wall, every single picture or post-it note that you've got up, whatever it is, even just what's on your computer and the little icons around it and everything. If you try to imagine describing the entire visual scene, it's very, very complicated. There's a lot of things you can see. Okay. Now, extraneous load is the sensory processing that's required to process what you're being shown. Now, if I want to teach you what a square is, and I show you a picture of a square, the extraneous load is fairly low. You can see the picture. I can point out key features of a square. There's 4 sides. They join at right angles. And okay, we assume that you know what some of these things mean, but it's quite straightforward. The extraneous load is low. Now imagine teaching someone what a square is and you're not allowed to show them any pictures. Easier or harder? Way harder, right? Do we all agree that teaching someone what a square is without being able to show them a picture, only being able to talk to them, is harder? Do we all agree? We've got at least 1 thumbs up, right?
Yes.
Anyone that thinks it's easier, come tell me. Okay. So the extraneous load is about the method in which we deliver something. We might be teaching someone quite a simple concept, but if it's crowded on a very complicated diagram, there's too much competing stimuli or information around them that it's drowning out, or it's distracting the person who's trying to learn from what it is they're supposed to pay attention to. So to reduce extraneous load, we need to reduce how much irrelevant information is also being presented at the same time. Okay. And we need to optimize the way in which we display the information. What's the best and clearest way of showing this information? I'm going to stop here to give you a very short story. Years and years ago, I started creating a learning platform, online learning platform. We had to write loads of content. We also had to produce loads of diagrams. Now, in science education is my main background. I've taught other things as well, but in science, you use a lot of diagrams to teach things. There's diagrams of photosynthesis, there's diagrams of a leaf, there's diagrams of animals, there's diagrams of all sorts of stuff. Okay, atoms, all the rest of it. What we end up doing is we end up thinking very carefully about the diagrams you were using. We actually, lots of the classic diagrams you see in textbooks are way more complicated than they need to be. The arrows are crisscrossing all over the place and people get lost trying to follow them. I mean, the classic diagrams of a nitrogen cycle, if anyone has ever taught biology, most textbooks have terrible diagrams of the nitrogen cycle. It looks like spaghetti junction. Students think the nitrogen cycle is extremely hard, almost always because they've seen a really complicated diagram with about 13 or 15 different arrows on it. What hope have you got? So we actually thought really carefully about how can we simplify this? How can we reduce how many arrows there are? How can we reduce how many crossovers there are so we don't have as much extraneous load? And we produced a nitrogen cycle diagram, which I'm really proud of. I could probably show it to you later, but I'm not going to try and do that now. But we produced a nitrogen cycle diagram, which was easy to understand. It was really straightforward. It was basically a circle with a crossbar in the middle. And you could easily see where different bits went without seeing all these arrows crisscrossing everywhere. And it's the same concept that's being taught. I'm not teaching a simplified or dumbed down version of the nitrogen cycle. If anything, I've made the what's actually taught more complicated. I've taught more information. I've taught more terminology, but I've simplified the way it's presented so that the extraneous load is less. So when you're teaching, really consider, how do we reduce the extraneous load? How do we make the information we're presenting easier to process? It might be the same amount of information. It doesn't have to be less. But how do we make the way we transmit that easier to process? Is a diagram more appropriate? Is the diagram we're using too complicated? Do we need to do a different version? Right? I used to draw all the diagrams. When I used to be a tutor full-time, I used to draw all the diagrams with pencil and paper. Okay, I have drawn the nitrogen cycle hundreds and hundreds of times, and atoms and loads of other things, the solar system, whatever else it is. When you draw these things many times, you get used to things that are irrelevant, things that are not helpful, things that maybe distract students and make things more complicated than they need to be. So extraneous load, how we present the processing power required to interpret the information and how it's being presented. Before we move on, I'm going to ask people what intrinsic load is. Who can give me a volunteer to give us a recap on what intrinsic load is? Oh, Georgina, go for it, please.
Is that related to how complicated the information is to start with? Like the square versus the forest?
Yeah, the information we're trying to learn. What are we trying to learn? How complicated is it? How many component parts does it have? Right? If I try and teach you a Chinese symbol and you've never seen Chinese before, the whole thing just looks like a mishmash of different lines in different places. None of it has any rhyme or reason or sense. Whereas if you know a set of Chinese symbols and how Chinese is constructed as a language, it's much more straightforward. You've got a label for this and it's easy. It represents one thing. Now that's to do with schema theory and how familiar you are with Chinese. But that then directly relates to the intrinsic load you have to process that information. Okay, and so it will be different for different people, because if the intrinsic load for me to understand a new topic or new concept in a subject I'm familiar with is going to be less than the intrinsic load for you if you don't understand the same subject, because you need to remember it as different component parts and you have no idea what the relation is together. You don't have any idea what the network's supposed to be. Okay, but intrinsic load is about the inherent complexity of what is being taught. The extraneous load. What is extraneous load? Anyone can volunteer an explanation for that? Patricia?
Yes, it's the method, the process in which it's delivered.
That's right. It's about how much cognitive effort is used to process what is being delivered. So simple, clear diagrams, succinct, refined explanations, these things reduce extraneous load. Long, waffly ramblings and overly complicated diagrams with lots of crossovers and all the rest of it massively increase extraneous load. I really, really wish that people that write textbooks would actually go and learn about extraneous load, because they don't often necessarily do a great job. Not because they've done anything wrong. Well, maybe they have done something wrong. Not because they're bad people, obviously, but they just didn't understand the extraneous load associated with what they're doing, what they're producing. It just wasn't on their, when people wrote textbooks for the first time, it just wasn't what was something they thought about. Now, there's a third type of cognitive load. This one is the exciting one. And it's also the one that typically when people learn about cognitive load, they have no bloody clue what it is. Okay, but it's really quite straightforward. The third type of cognitive load is called germane cognitive load. Germane cognitive load is the effort used to create new connections between something you're being presented with and something you already know. Now, hazard a guess. Is this good for learning or bad for learning? Straightforward, I hope. Thumbs up from some people. I'm hoping other people are thinking it's a good thing. Very good. This is basically what learning is. If you don't have any room left for germane cognitive load, you don't have any learning. Then students get bored and switch off and pay attention to something else because they don't understand what on earth you were talking about. Okay. Domain cognitive load is the effort that we put in to link pieces of information that are being shown or that's been delivered to us in some format. It could be speech, could be a diagram, could be a picture, whatever it is, and information we already know. You might listen to a piece of music. Oh, that's by the Beatles, or that's by Mozart, or that's by someone else, right? You're making a link between it. Well, it sounds like it's by somebody else or some particular person. It sounds like a piece of music by Taylor Swift, right? Okay, because it sounds like her voice. If you hear a new Taylor Swift song and you've ever heard any other Taylor Swift songs, you probably recognize it's her voice, right? Maybe none of you are Swifties, I don't know. But the same thing if you listen to a piece of Vivaldi. If you listen to a piece of Vivaldi and you listen to other pieces of Vivaldi in the past, you probably recognize, oh, it sounds a lot like Vivaldi because it had a certain style, right? When you're making connections between new sensory information and existing knowledge, that is germane cognitive load. There is cognitive effort going into that process. Okay. So this is the type of cognitive load we want, but you can't only have germane cognitive load. You have to be thinking about something. You have to be thinking about something you already know and something that's new to start off with, right? Which takes up some of your working memory capacity. You can't make links between things that are not in your head. Okay. So we've got 3 types of cognitive load. Intrinsic, which is about the complexity of what we're trying to learn. We've got extraneous, which is about how complicated the way in which it's transmitted is. There will be some level of extraneous load, but we just want to minimize it. And then we've got germane cognitive load, which is about how much effort is required to make links between something and what we already know. Now, germane cognitive load can be higher or lower for different people in different contexts for the same lesson, if you like, depending on how much they already know that's related to this topic. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine, does anyone here like Taylor Swift? I mean, maybe you're not gonna. There we go. Someone, right? You've heard Taylor Swift before, right? You've heard some of the music before. You've got to have heard of it before to like it. So if Taylor Swift releases a new song, okay, because you've heard lots of examples of Taylor Swift's music in the past, and you've presumably heard them at least more than once, right? You've not listened to the song only once each time. You've heard it on the radio several times, whatever, or you've got it on Spotify. When you hear a new Taylor Swift song, you've got lots of reference points. You've got lots of examples to link it to. It sounds like this. It sounds like this. It sounds like her voice because you're familiar with her voice, right? And you're not going to be confused. It's not like you think it's somebody else. Yeah. You don't go, oh, that sounds like Madonna. Well, it doesn't. Yeah. When you've got a lot of examples of prior knowledge, the germane cognitive load is less. Making the connections is easier. Okay. And faster. So you can make connections between the new piece of information and what you already know very quickly. Exactly the same happens when we teach children geometric shapes in maths, or when children read the 5th Roald Dahl book instead of their 1st Roald Dahl book. They've started to get used to the vocabulary that's being used. They've started to get used to the way the books are written. They've started to get used to the way the plot is developed in those books. So making the connections and reading the book is a more fluid experience for them. It's easier for them. Things are always hardest the first time you do them. I don't think you really turned up here because you needed me to tell you that. But what I'm doing now is I'm trying to explain to you why that is the case. Because the germane load is less. Okay? The germane load is reduced when you already have a lot of prior information, because making those connections is very quick and very easy. If I was to try and teach you about somebody or something where you've got very little related prior knowledge, it's much, much harder. Okay? It's harder to pay attention because it doesn't seem to relate to anything that you know of. Not only is it harder to pay attention, your retention is likely to be worse. You're not going to remember as much afterwards anyway. And you don't enjoy it as much either. Okay? If I was to sit here and say, guys, I'm going to give you a long lecture now about, I don't know, a Chinese emperor. Who knows about the Qing dynasty? Not many hands flying up, right? So if I start going, oh, we're going to all learn about the first Qing emperor, very soon you're going to be glazed over, like, oh, I don't really know anything about him. So what? And I can give you examples of things he did, but you probably don't even know the places I'm going to mention, the people I'm going to talk about. You don't know any of them. So it doesn't make very much sense. There's nothing to link it to. It's very hard work to pay attention to that. So very swiftly, you start thinking, oh, what am I having for dinner today? Yeah, what's going on? Or, oh, my partner wants me to do X, Y, and Z later. I best not forget. Okay, very soon you're switched off. Because the domain cognitive load is just way, way too high if you don't have any prior knowledge that you can really anchor this to. Yeah. It's like when I actually first started, when I did my A-level history, I was told by my teacher, you could pick any topic you like. Now, I thought I was being a smart ass. So I just basically said, okay, fine. I'm going to pick the first Japanese shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty. I'm going to study him. My teacher laughed at me and said, oh, you can't do that. No one knows about him anyway. You teachers can't even mark it. So I said, oh, don't worry, watch me. Anyway, I did. It was probably very foolish of me to do this, but never mind, I did it anyway. Silly me at the time. So I went off to the Japanese embassy. The head of history in my school was like, oh, great, well, go to the Japanese embassy, go and learn all this stuff. I was quite good at history anyway. So I think he just said, well, go on then. If you've bitten off more than you can chew, go at least try it. So he sent me off to the Japanese embassy and said, get all the books you need to go and read about this topic. So, all right, fine, I will. So I went off to the Japanese embassy in Piccadilly and I picked up all these books. I got them home. I read the first page. I was like, oh my goodness. I had to close the book. I was like, don't even understand anything I've just read. It was all like names of people I've never heard of, places I've never heard of. It wasn't like, oh, they went to Tokyo. No, Tokyo didn't exist back then. So now it's all like different places and all this stuff. So I had to reread and sort of piece together from the beginning, right? This person, he's this person's dad. This person is his uncle. And this person is his best friend. So when anyone else talks about that person later on, I know he's going to be friends. And it was really quite hard. It was a great challenge. In the end, obviously being stubborn and a little bit stupid, I eventually got around it because I was sort of determined, but it took a lot of determination, right? If I wasn't a particularly committed history student, I'd have gone, oh, let's forget that. It's too hard. Let's pick something easier. I don't know, World War II or something. Or something like that. But the example here is that the domain cognitive load is high if you don't have prior knowledge. Did anyone notice how I started off this whole session by talking about schema theory? Right? The people that were there at the beginning of this. Well, it's not because this session's about schema theory, but it's just if I start talking about schema and schemata halfway through and you've never heard of them, it's not going to be very useful, is it? What would happen to your domain cognitive load? Sky high. You wouldn't be able to, you wouldn't understand what I'm talking about. What is the schema thing that he's talking about? Okay. So we've got 3 different forms of cognitive load. Now is the moment of truth when I'm going to ask you all, and I'm going to pick people. I'm not going to let you put your hand up. I'm going to pick people and hope you come off mute and don't just ignore me and see if you remember. Okay. Because questions are the foundation of any good learning. So let's start with maybe Naomi. Naomi, are you with us? Naomi? Nope, maybe no evidence. She might have gone and got a cup of tea. Okay, Amy, you're with us.
I am.
Yes. Okay, what's extraneous cognitive load?
That is optimizing the way that you're presenting the information.
Naomi's coming in a minute. Naomi, I've got a question for you. Don't worry, I'm coming back. Okay, Amy, yeah, optimizing the way you're presenting the information. Extraneous cognitive load is optimizing the way you present the information. How do you get it across them? Is it a diagram? Is it speech? Is it music? Is it actions? Is it whatever? Now, does anyone remember VAK, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learning styles? I don't like them, by the way. So if you like them, you're going to be upset because I'm going to say they're rubbish. But anyway, this is why they're rubbish, because what I was told when I was doing my teaching, right, when I was learning to be a teacher, they were like, oh, these children are kinesthetic. And I don't know why this is, but it's always the students in the lowest set that get told they're kinesthetic. Did anyone ever notice that? All the ones that, I don't know, if you were being uncharitable, you'd say this is a dumb set, right? They were all the ones that would say, oh, these are all kinesthetic learners. And I was like, what? All of these children that haven't got a clue, they don't have a clue what's going on in school. They don't know how to read and write properly. So obviously they can't really access most of the curriculum. They're not very good at any maths or numeracy. And anyway, they said, well, they must be kinesthetic. So act out. I'm like, guys, what are you talking about? I'm teaching them microscopes. What am I going to act out? Pretend I'm dancing under a microscope? Are you joking me? And, oh, yeah, do some acting thing or whatever. I'm like, this is just mental. Anyway, being a very young teacher at the time, I was a trainee teacher, right? And I've got all these experienced teachers around me telling me this is the thing to do. And I was being told, oh, act out microscopy. I'm like, that's not helpful. That's not helpful for them learning microscopy, to act out something. I know. What am I going to do? Act out being a focusing knob. What does that even mean? Right? So all of this stuff was just nonsense. And it wasn't that acting something out works in some contexts. Acting something out works if you're trying to describe what a character is like in a certain play. Oh, act out being this character. It gets people to think about, oh, what are their mannerisms going to be like? How are they going to talk to people? Are they mean? Are they friendly? Are they kind? How do they sound? That makes perfect sense. But acting out being a microscope, guys, that's just rubbish. That is just rubbish. No one can convince me otherwise now. I've learned too much in my life to come back to that. So there are certain things which are best done visually and certain things that are best done in an auditory way. Don't tell me a bunch of visual learners are going to learn Mozart best by just looking at sheet music. What? That's not true. Okay? So if anyone wants to learn about what Mozart's music sounds like, play them Mozart's music. If anyone wants to learn about cellular biology, show them a diagram, show them a micrograph, show them pictures or whatever it is. If anyone wants to learn about a microscope, show them a microscope, for goodness sake. And if you want to go and you want to learn about what Romeo and Juliet must have thought about their own families when they were in the middle of the storyline, okay, fine, act out. And you can act out how would they have interacted with their parents when they were scared of their parents, but they loved their lover or whatever, right? Okay, acting in that context might be really useful. So it's not about teaching things in a visual way being bad or in an auditory way being bad or in a kinesthetic way being bad. I fully agree with what Marianne is saying in the chat. The pigeonholing of people into one category or another is complete cobblers. Okay? It doesn't make any sense. So, you're absolutely right, Amy. The neurodivergent learners are the ones that suffered most of this because they were just pigeonholed into trying to learn everything by some sort of charades, which was so bloody hard. No wonder they never got it. I mean, I was a terrible teacher when I was at school because I was taught to do all these wacky things. Did not work. And then obviously the students played up and I was like, well, I have to give you a detention because that's what the school behavior policy says. And I'm the first person to admit it didn't work. It was rubbish. Total nonsense. However, I now know it was total nonsense and I know why. And I can see the error of my ways looking back. And I'm not too arrogant to say I did a bad job. I've now learned what a good job looks like. But you have to go through this process of learning and understanding what practice you've done in the past didn't work. We should all admit where we've made mistakes, right? So, Naomi, I promised I'm coming back to you. You ready?
Yes.
You found the mute button. I'm glad. Or the unmute button, I should say.
Yeah.
What is intrinsic cognitive load, Naomi?
Oh, is that the information you're trying to process at any one time?
Yeah, well, it's the complexity of the information you're trying to learn.
Right.
Yeah. In particular, how complex is the new components of it? Yeah, because if it's stuff that you're familiar with, you understand it well already, it doesn't take up much processing power, right? If you wanted to have a conversation with me now about Japanese history, I'm on it. I can understand whatever you say. If you say, oh yeah, Honda Tadakatsu did this, I completely understand the context, right? I know who he was, I know who he worked with, I know who his friends were, I know who his enemies were. So it makes complete sense to me. I understand it. But for you, the intrinsic load for that is quite high because you have no idea who he is, probably can't even remember his name. You have no idea his relation to anybody else. You don't even know when he was born or died, right? So it doesn't make any sense. So intrinsic cognitive load is the complexity of what we're trying to learn, the new information, okay? Obviously, it's more difficult and more complex if we don't have any familiarity with it. Let's pick on somebody else. Natasha? Natasha, can you hear us? Not sure.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Natasha, can you hear us? Hello?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? I'm here.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Hang on. Perfect.
Okay.
Sorry. Could everyone else hear Natasha before me? You could. Good. Okay. Natasha, what's your main cognitive load?
It's the third one. It's
Good stuff.
it is at the end. It's making it fit with what you already know.
Perfect. It's the amount of cognitive effort required to make connections between new pieces of information. Now you've got past the hurdle of understanding it. You've got past the hurdle of extraneous cognitive load and how it's transmitted to you. Now you've got the new information. You've got to link it to something you already know in order for you to remember it, right? I can teach you how to remember a certain, like the name of a person you've never heard of, but it doesn't mean anything. If I start telling you this is what they did, this is where they went, this is who their friends were, then it makes sense, right? So germane cognitive load is linking things to existing prior knowledge. And the more prior knowledge you have, the lower the germane load is going to be. The faster you learn and the more robust the learning is going to be. So there's a lot of implications here for how you teach. Is anyone, first of all, quick show of hands, has anyone found that there's been anything new today that they didn't know before? Or at least more detailed than they knew before? At least some people put in, all right, great. Nearly everyone. Okay, that's good. No one's wasted all their time then. Perfect. Okay, now does anyone think they're going to change anything about their teaching and they know what they're going to change already? I mean, some people might be going away thinking, great, there's loads of stuff there, but I don't know what I'm going to do about it yet. Does anyone know already some things they might do to change the way they teach? I've given you a couple of hints. Does anyone want to come off mute and just tell us? Diagrams. Oh yeah, I love diagrams, and I love well thought through diagrams, and I hate terrible diagrams. It's so annoying. Honestly, when you compare really good diagrams with really rubbish diagrams, you never go back. Anyone else? Louise, what are you going to change, Louise?
Hello. Yes. To be honest, I always struggle with applying it to what I teach, which is English, because obviously it's easy to say simplify a diagram. And I always struggle to find how I'll apply that to English, to be honest.
Yes, I'd say same here, Louise. I teach English, and yes, the need to be succinct and clear is becoming even clearer. Of course, it's obvious, but it's become clearer today. So thank you.
Hello? Can you hear me now? Right. Funny story there. What just happened is, I said I've borrowed a laptop because my old laptop is old now. It was my actual laptop a minute ago. Okay, my actual laptop broke. Well, actually, I've borrowed a laptop and it's connected to somebody else's AirPods, and so now they were. Right, can you hear me again? Okay. Right. So we were talking about examples in English before tech issues nearly hijacked me. So in English, a lot of students, they read books that are set in a context that they're not familiar with. Okay. And a really good thing is, rather than just reading terminology that they're not familiar with about a context they're not familiar with, maybe show them pictures of what this scene would look like. So for example, in Treasure Island, they walk down a dock and it gives loads of nautical jargon, right? But students don't really know, especially like if they're 11 years old, they don't understand what all this stuff is, like how a vessel is, a square rigged vessel. What on earth is that to a student that's 11 years old, right? And all these other things that they don't necessarily understand. I mean, ask them, take them and say, well, do you know exactly what a tavern is? Some of them are like not really sure. They don't really understand what a tavern is in the context. They're sort of expecting, like, I don't know, maybe there's some really swishy upmarket gastropub in the next village or something, which they go to, which is called the something something tavern. And that's definitely not what's being referred to when you've got pirates and swashbucklers on the seafront, all drinking and swilling loads of beer, right? A gastropub it is not, right? So the context can be a really interesting one in English, because again, displaying the context is, you can often really easily do it using a short video or with an image that gets round some of the jargon and helps to convey a sense of what is actually being meant by what the story says, right? If you're teaching First World War poetry, obviously this is probably for older students to something like a GCSE level, showing them a short clip of like the film 1917, which just shows quite how ghastly the First World War was, helps them to understand what were what the poets, what were they actually trying to refer to, what were they seeing that got them to write this poem, right? Or like in Flanders Fields or whatever it is, that the poem is written with a certain scene and context in mind that the student doesn't know, and just reading the poem and then reading another 300-word description of the trench warfare is not going to convey the same visceral feeling of, oh crap, that looks terrible, right? When you watch like a 2-minute clip of a film that's set in World War I, you realize, oh my gosh, it's a disaster, what a nightmare, right? Everyone's dying left, right, and center and getting blown to bits. Okay, now obviously you want to maybe don't share them something too graphic, but the point stands that you can in English find that there are other ways to convey context or other ways to convey meaning. It might be that you get them to act out as a certain character, or that you acting out as a certain character helps them to understand a bit more about what that character is actually like, that's beyond just the words on the page. Okay, so does that help, Louise?
Yeah, a little, and I've certainly done elements of that before. But the majority of things that I'm working with people on is obviously you know, writing. They've done a lot of that understanding work in school, that context work and things most of the time, and then I'm trying to improve their writing.
Obviously, when it's grammatical, these things are not the best way to convey it, right? You don't teach someone grammar by showing them a video clip. I mean, this is a video clip about literally showing them where the commas go or something. But yeah, there are places where you shouldn't be afraid of doing it how you think it's best to be done. And if it looks like the boring way, but that's actually the most effective way, your job is to be effective, not just to be entertaining or showbiz or performer. So if actually the most effective thing is just to show them, John doesn't know the verb song. I don't think I know the verb song. Sounds very thrilling. I'm going to go and have to check up on YouTube. But if there's just a fairly straightforward way of doing it, which just involves pen and paper and literally writing and showing them where the commas go, where they don't go, and talking it through with them, that can be the best way of doing things. Yeah, it is sometimes the case that something that's straightforward and clear is the simplest lowest extraneous load way of conveying a piece of information. So sometimes it's actually the case that you're already doing it the right way, and you just need the confidence to know why that's the right way, and why trying to turn it into some sort of snazzy performance art is not going to be more effective. Because I remember back in the day when it used to be way more fashionable to try and turn everything into some sort of whiz bang pop lesson, and actually you turn around and think, was it better than just teaching them what it was? Sometimes no, right? But it's about using your judgment, and using your judgment with reasoning to select what is the best approach to teach any given thing, right? Sometimes it is going to be straightforward pen and paper. Let's get down to it. Let's look at how you calculate fractions. Let's look at how you punctuate a sentence. Yeah, where do we use capital letters? What are the rules? Okay, learning the rule doesn't necessarily mean we have to do any snazzy teaching method. Okay, has anyone got any other questions? Louise, does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
If you've got a tried and tested method that is clear and easy to follow, don't be persuaded to change it because somebody else thinks something's going to be more engaging. Remember when people in schools, you say, oh, it's more engaging. Don't do it the old fashioned way. Do it this way. Well, sometimes it's more engaging and sometimes it's just more confusing. So use your judgment. Okay. Has anyone got any questions for me? Because I appreciate I started a little bit late. So if we need to ask any questions, it's fine. But has anyone got any questions for me? Nope. No questions at all? Was there one in the chat? Nope. Brilliant. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much for attending. We are going to publish the recording online later on. But I hope you've all found it useful, and I hope it makes an impact for your future teaching.